They said Freddie Eugene Owens wouldn't see the end of the week. The clock was ticking. His execution was scheduled, final, sealed, and inevitable. Convicted of the 1997 murder of Irene Graves, a gas station clerk in Greenville, South Carolina, Owens had spent decades on death row. The centerpiece of the case against him? The damning testimony of his co-defendant, Stephen Golden. For years, Golden's words painted Owens as the trigger man. That testimony helped secure a death sentence. But yesterday, everything shifted. In a last-minute twist, Golden came forward with a bombshell confession. He had lied under oath, lied to investigators, lied to the court. Now Golden claims Owens wasn't even there the night Irene Graves was killed. Owens' legal team scrambled, rushing to file an emergency motion in the final hours before the execution. But the South Carolina Supreme Court didn't bite. They said Golden's new story contradicted his old ones too much, and without solid evidence to back it, the motion was denied. Even so, Owens' attorneys begged for mercy. They urged the state to pause, just long enough to reconsider. Because once the injection starts, there's no reversing it. Meanwhile, reporters and camera crews headed toward Columbia, South Carolina, waiting to cover what could be Owens' final moments. But here's the thing. This isn't a story that begins and ends with a gas station robbery. It spirals deeper into the corridors of a prison where another life was lost. Less than 12 hours after arriving behind bars in 1999, Freddie Owens committed a second, even more shocking murder. In the overcrowded, chaotic Greenville County Jail, Owens shared a cell with 10 other inmates. That night, something inside him fractured. One of his cellmates, a 28-year-old man named Christopher Brian Lee, was serving a minor sentence for a traffic violation. Just 90 days. He should have walked out of there alive, but Owens made sure he didn't. According to Owens, Lee taunted him, claimed his family sat on the jury that condemned him. Whether the claim was real or not didn't matter. Owens saw red. In what can only be described as a frenzy, Owens attacked with raw, unfiltered rage. He beat Lee senseless. Then he grabbed a pen, stabbed him in the throat, in the eye. He found a bedsheet and wrapped it around Lee's neck, squeezing until life slipped away. It didn't end there. As if driven by something deeper, darker, Owens took out a lighter and set Lee's hair and eyes ablaze. Then, in a grotesque final act, he jammed a pin into one of Lee's nostrils and held the other shut, cutting off his last breath. By the time the guards arrived, Lee was gone, burned, beaten, silenced. And Owens? He didn't deny a thing. The next day in court, he confessed, calmly, openly. So what kind of person does that, just hours after hearing he'd be executed? This isn't just about crime and punishment. It's about a man whose actions defied logic. A man whose rage burst out in ways that even seasoned officers couldn't comprehend. A man whose life, even after sentencing, kept veering into darkness. It's also about a broken system, one that hands out justice, but not always certainty. Whether you support the death penalty or not, some cases force you to pause, because they challenge your belief in what justice truly looks like. Freddie Owens' story isn't a scripted thriller. It happened. Every detail, every death, every delay. And now, after years of appeals, legal twists, and a second murder behind bars, his execution date arrived again, this time with fewer chances to escape it. In this video, we'll unpack the timeline, from the gas station shooting to the prison killing. We'll talk about Freddie's final meal, his last words, and the final minutes before he was strapped to the gurney. Because for Freddie Eugene Owens, death wasn't just a sentence, it was a waiting game. Welcome to the channel. Here we explore the lives of death row inmates, the crimes, the trials, and the final moments before the curtain falls. If you're interested in the untold stories behind the headlines, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Freddie Eugene Owens entered this world on March 18, 1978 in South Carolina, born into a storm before he could ever speak a word. His mother was barely more than a child herself, just 18, when she gave birth to him. From day one, Freddie's world was marked by chaos, not just poverty, not just confusion, but the kind of pain that plants itself deep in the bones and waits. By age 5, the state had already intervened. Freddie was taken from his home, not for a better life, but for protection, abuse, neglect, the kind of words no child should ever have associated with their earliest memories. But even foster care didn't offer peace. He was bounced around, passed from stranger to stranger like a problem nobody wanted to solve. Eventually, he was returned to his mother. By then, she had separated from Freddie's biological father, a violent man whose fists left scars on everyone in the house. But the new man in her life wasn't any better. Freddie watched his mother get beaten by this stepfather over and over. The message was clear. Violence wasn't just around him, it was the air he breathed. Then came the moment that etched itself into his soul. 7 years old, standing just a few feet away when his grandmother pulled a trigger and shot a man. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a nightmare. It was his life. Real, unforgiving, and utterly normal for him. Freddie's behavior spiraled. He lashed out. He didn't trust anyone. He couldn't follow rules because rules never protected him. Eventually, professionals gave it a name, antisocial personality disorder. But a diagnosis doesn't change a child's reality. It just puts a label on the wounds. By 19, Freddie wasn't just another lost kid. He was broken in places that had never healed, and he didn't have therapy or guidance. He had rage. That was the only thing that made sense to him anymore. And then, one night in November, it all came to a head. November 1st, 1997, Greenville, South Carolina. The sky was clear, the streets mostly quiet. Just another chilly evening. But for Freddie Owens, it would become the night that defined the rest of his life and ended another. He wasn't acting alone. That night, he was with 3 others, Lester Young, Nikki Vance, and Stephen Andrew Golden. Together, they set out with a plan, split into 2 pairs and hit separate locations. Robberies. Fast, efficient. No one gets hurt. At least that's what people like to tell themselves. Freddie and Golden targeted a small neighborhood convenience store. Golden pulled a stocking mask over his face. Freddie chose a ski mask. They walked in like shadows, purposeful and silent. Behind the counter was Irene Grainger Graves, 41 years old, a single mother working the late shift, probably thinking about her 3 kids at home, a daughter, 2 sons. Maybe she'd been counting the minutes until she could clock out, but time was something she didn't have. Owens pointed a gun at her, demanded she open the safe. And here's where things get murky. Maybe Irene was too afraid. Maybe she didn't know the code. Maybe she froze like anyone would in a moment like that. But what's certain is that the safe stayed shut. And Freddie didn't wait. According to Stephen Golden's later testimony, the moment Irene failed to open the safe, Owens made a decision that would seal his fate. He raised the gun, pulled the trigger, 1 shot, straight to the head. She collapsed behind the counter, gone in an instant. No warning, no screaming, no time for mercy, just cold, mechanical violence. Then, with her body still warm on the ground, Owens and Golden emptied the register, $37.29. That's what Irene Graves' life was reduced to in that moment. Not even enough to fill a gas tank. They ran. And later that night, in a chilling moment that still echoes through court transcripts, Freddie bragged about what he'd done, told the others straight out, "I shot her." No remorse. No trembling voice, just the words of a 19-year-old who had turned real-life horror into a casual sentence. Irene never got to go home. Her children would wake up to news that would gut their world. Their mother, their rock, gone forever for pocket change. And as for Freddie Eugene Owens, this wasn't the end of his spiral. It was only the beginning. It took just 10 days. On November 11th, 1997, Freddie Eugene Owens was finally in handcuffs. There was no dramatic chase. No last stand. When the police showed up, he surrendered without a fight. But surrender didn't mean confession. Owens said he didn't do it. Said he didn't pull the trigger. Said they had the wrong guy. But the evidence? It was already mounting against him. Fast. The surveillance footage from the gas station didn't show faces. It showed masks. 2 of them. One man in a stocking cap, the other in a ski mask. The ski mask wearing man fired the fatal shot. Investigators believed that man was Owens, and it wasn't just the footage. Witnesses started speaking. His own mother, his girlfriend, even another co-conspirator. All of them claimed Owens had told them he shot the clerk. But the nail in the coffin? That came from inside the robbery. Stephen Andrew Golden, the man who stood right beside Owens during the crime, he testified under oath. It was Freddie. He pulled the trigger. Golden struck a deal, avoiding a death sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He pleaded to voluntary manslaughter and was handed 28 years behind bars. But Owens, he wasn't interested in deals. He said he was innocent. He wanted a trial. February 8, 1999, Greenville County. Owens stood before the court charged with murder, armed robbery, criminal conspiracy, and illegal use of a firearm. The trial lasted a week. He denied everything. Denied being the shooter. Denied taking a mother from her children. But the courtroom heard everything. The testimonies, the footage, the cold, heartless details, and most importantly, they saw the 3 children Irene Graves left behind, motherless. February 15th. The jury didn't hesitate. Guilty on all counts. The court scheduled his death penalty hearing for 2 days later. But Owens wouldn't wait. Within hours of that conviction, he killed again, this time behind bars. The victim? Christopher Brian Lee, 28 years old. He wasn't a killer, wasn't part of the robbery. He was serving a short sentence, just 90 days for a traffic offense, just in the wrong place, at the worst time. Lee shared a cell with 10 other inmates, including Owens, and that night Owens snapped. He claimed Lee taunted him, said his cousin had been on the jury, mocked him about the death sentence. That one comment, true or not, was enough to light a fuse that had been burning for years. What followed wasn't just an outburst. It was a brutal, drawn-out execution. Owens beat Lee viciously. Then he grabbed a pen, stabbed him in the eye and the throat. He wrapped a sheet around Lee's neck and strangled him until he stopped breathing. But he didn't stop there. He set Lee's face and eyes on fire with a lighter, then shoved a pen into one nostril and clamped the other shut, suffocating him in the most horrific way possible. Lee died on the floor of that cell in agony, surrounded by men who could do nothing. And Owens? The next morning, he walked into court for his sentencing and confessed, openly, calmly, detail by detail. No apology, no tears, no remorse. Just a man who said he had been wrongly convicted and had nothing left to lose. The courtroom was stunned. Even hardened prosecutors paused, not just because of the horror, but because of how matter-of-fact he was. The prosecution called him exactly what he had proven himself to be, a threat to anyone around him. A man with no boundaries, no hesitation, no conscience. They reminded the court that Irene Graves' children were still grieving. Now, so was Christopher Lee's family, a son dead for no reason. That same day, Owens was formally sentenced to die. But what followed wasn't closure. It was the beginning of a legal war. Years of appeals, motions, and last-ditch efforts to challenge the system. And through it all, Owens kept fighting. From prison, from solitary, from death row. This wasn't the end of the Freddie Eugene Owens story. It was only the start of a long countdown, one that would stretch across decades, through legal twists, public debates, and a haunting question at the center of it all. What do you do with a man who won't stop killing, even after he's been condemned? On South Carolina's death row, time doesn't pass. It lingers. It stretches and stalls. It waits. And for over 20 years, Freddie Eugene Owens sat in that suspended state, locked in a cell, waiting for the day the state would finally end his life. But those decades weren't silent. Behind bars, Freddie Owens began to change, or, depending on who you ask, to evolve. Not in the legal sense. Not in the eyes of the court. To them, he remained inmate ill, convicted, condemned, and unredeemable. But within those walls, something else was happening. In 2015, long after the courtroom lights had dimmed and the media had moved on, Owens embraced a new identity. He converted to Islam and took on a name that reflected the person he believed he had become. Khalil Divine Black Son Allah. It wasn't a disguise. It wasn't for show. To the prison system, he was still Freddie Owens. But to himself, he had been reborn. Inside that cage of steel and concrete, he began writing. Long essays, quiet poetry, personal reflections on a lifetime of trauma, violence, and regret. His words carried pain, but also search for purpose. He explored African history with a hunger, reading about Timbuktu's ancient libraries and the military defiance of Queen Amanirenas. He learned Arabic, studied it with discipline. He prayed, he fasted, he spoke of peace, even as the clock above his head kept ticking toward death. Then came 2024. The date was set. His execution loomed. The state offered him a choice: lethal injection, electric chair, or a firing squad. It sounded clinical, clean, bureaucratic. But for Owens, now Khalil, this wasn't a matter of logistics. It was spiritual. Islam forbids suicide. And in his eyes, choosing how he died felt dangerously close to participating in it. For him, selecting the method of execution meant giving in. It meant agreeing to die on the state's terms. his own hand guiding the process. So he refused. He wouldn't pick. Instead, he made a rare and deeply personal request. He asked his legal team to decide for him, not because he feared death, but because his faith would not allow him to make the choice. His attorneys later confirmed it wasn't a tactic to delay the inevitable. It was an act of conviction, a way to stay spiritually intact even as the system closed in. But even as the hours dwindled, Owens's team kept fighting. Just 48 hours before the scheduled execution, they submitted a last-minute appeal. This time, they had something new, a statement from Stephen Golden, the same co-defendant who had testified against Owens decades earlier. Golden now said he had lied. He claimed Owens wasn't the shooter, that he had falsely named him, that the real killer was someone else, a man so terrifying Golden wouldn't even name him, even after all these years. It should have changed everything. But it didn't. The South Carolina Supreme Court read the statement and swiftly rejected it. They pointed to Owens's own words, confessions made not just to the police, but to his mother, his girlfriend, even in open court after murdering another man in jail. To the judges, Golden's reversal was too little too late, too shaky to trust, too convenient to believe. The ruling was final. The execution would move forward. No more appeals, no more delays, no more chances. This was the end of the line. The final morning arrived quietly. Inside the heavily guarded walls of Broad River Correctional Institution, Freddie Eugene Owens sat in a cell just steps from the execution chamber, a place known among inmates as Death Watch. He had been waiting here, hour by hour, breath by breath, knowing this day would come. But he hadn't waited in fear, at least not outwardly. He had made peace in the only way he knew how. Nearly a decade earlier, in 2015, Owens embraced Islam in a new name, Khalil Divine Black Son Allah. Since then, he followed the faith's teachings with precision. That discipline extended even to his death. When given the option between lethal injection, electric chair, or firing squad, he refused to choose. To him, choosing was participation, and participation, he believed, meant suicide, a violation of everything he now stood for. So in a gesture of faith and defiance, he handed the burden to his attorney. She chose lethal injection. Midday came. Owens was served his final meal, a heavy plate of familiar comforts, 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, a well-done ribeye steak, 6 chicken wings, 2 strawberry sodas, and a slice of apple pie. He ate it alone. No words, no reactions, just silence, and the slow ticking of the clock. As the sun sank behind the walls of the prison, he turned inward. He spent his final hours in prayer, joined by a Muslim spiritual advisor. There were no last-minute phone calls, no family goodbyes. Owens declined any visits. His circle had narrowed to one, his lawyer. 6:36 p.m. The chamber lights flickered on. Owens was led into the room, laid gently onto the gurney, and strapped down. The execution team administered a single potent dose of pentobarbital, a drug that halts the body in stages, slowing the breath, stopping the heart, and finally stilling everything else. As the drugs took hold, Owens turned to his attorney. "Bye," he said, calm, soft, almost casual. She answered with the same word, nothing more. Witnesses noted his breathing grew slow, shallow. A few flickers crossed his face, twitches, subtle and brief. Then stillness. 6:54 p.m. A medical staff member entered, checked his vitals. No pulse, no breath. 6:55 p.m. The official declaration, Freddie Eugene Owens was dead. In the small observation area, family members of both Irene Graves and Christopher Brian Lee stood behind glass, watching. Some wept, some didn't blink. All of them carried pain that had waited years for this moment. This was South Carolina's first execution in over a decade. 13 years since the last life was taken by state order. And for Owens, it ended nearly 3 decades of trials, appeals, protests, and spiritual transformation. Under the sterile hum of fluorescent lights, a man who once embodied chaos finally came to rest. There were no outbursts, no final speeches, no last words to the families whose lives he shattered. Just bye. And then nothing. Some called it closure. Others called it justice delayed. For a few, it wasn't enough. And for many, it came far too late. September 20th, 2024, 6:55 p.m. A date, a time, a final line in a story marked by violence, guilt, faith, and fate. But the real weight of the Freddie Eugene Owens case wasn't in the execution. It lived in everything that led there. In the mother who didn't get to come home, in the cellmate who never stood a chance, in the system that spent decades trying to answer one impossible question: what does justice truly look like when lives are already lost? This was the last page in a long, disturbing chapter, the end of Freddie Eugene Owens. But not the end of the conversation, because stories like this, they never really stop echoing. This is why true crime matters,